Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red, and we have got a great show for you guys today. In just a little bit, we are going to be joined by Lydia Assouad. Many of you know that name. She is a researcher and economist, and she's done a lot of work on inequality in Lebanon. And so we're going to be sort of unpacking that and going through that a little bit later. But first, I am joined, as always, by Nizar Hassan and Timour Asari. Hey guys, how's it going?
No, it's fine. I mean, just another week of everything feeling like it's falling apart and the wheels are coming off. How about you, Nizar?
Yeah, same.
I love the motivation there. You seem like you're doing really well, my friend.
We did have a lot of stuff go on this week, and a lot of really important developments that we need to go through in our recap of the week. I mean, first off, just keeping in touch with everything going on became a little bit more difficult this week because we're still under some sort of lockdown for COVID-19, but electricity really started to fail. The state electricity really started to fail this week, and so a lot of us saw major power cuts, even here in Beirut. I know in my building, for instance, we do have a backup generator, which is pretty common amongst a lot of people in Beirut. But even that sometimes would go out. And so we were left for some small stretches of time without any electricity. And I know for other people, it was much worse. And especially people who don't have access to the generators, they were just sitting in darkness for much longer than they normally do, even here in Beirut, which usually gets something like 21 hours of electricity. That's probably, I didn't count the hours, but it seemed as though we were getting something, more like 12 hours. And apparently this was due to a lack of fuel. And there apparently, according to an EDL statement that came out on Thursday, there was some issue with processing the payments for the fuel, which they said, oh, no, this is being taken care of. Apparently, Ghazi Wezni on Friday signed some documents that should allow for fuel ships to come and dock and offload their fuel so that the electricity grid can start to get fed again. Now, EDL didn't give any sort of timeline as to when the electricity situation is going to get better, but hopefully over the next few days, things will start to sort of return to normal. But I think in the long term, we're still facing, the electricity sector, it has been problematic ever since, the Civil War, essentially, and it's never truly been fixed. And so right now, if we're looking forward, what's going to happen over the next week? Okay, maybe things are going to get a bit better. But if we're looking a little bit further out, the next few months, something like that, then a lot of other factors are going to come into play that really, really look bad for electricity service provision in the country. We have several issues coming up, not just the fuel thing. The fuel thing is a major thing. Lebanon still doesn't know where it's going to be getting fuel from, although there was an agreement with Iraq, which is problematic for other reasons, quality of fuel, etc., how that fuel would be refined or would be made usable for Lebanon's power system. So there's the fuel issue, but also just getting equipment for maintenance and operations. Lebanon's grid is pretty rickety. And so whenever you have any sort of issue that requires maintenance, well, you have to buy parts for that. You need dollars in order to do that oftentimes. And so once again, we see the financial crisis has impacted the electricity sector as well in a very, very bad way, leading to what we see as harder to get fuel, harder to get spare parts or other parts to maintain the electrical network. And then also, you can add on to these factors other things like the August 4th Beirut port explosion, which was right next to the BDL building and really, really heavily damaged that building. And not only that, it wiped out, the EDL used to have this central control room there where they could, flip switches and direct things on the direct electricity across the grid. That is no longer there. That the EDL has no capacity to do that anymore. So that is an issue as well. And then we also just have the issue of the expiring contracts. So for fuel, we had the Sonatrach contract that ended at the end of last year. And then we just a few weeks ago had the contract with Prime South, which operates the Deir Ammar and Zahrani plants. That expired. The company said that they'll keep going for a bit, but that's all very tentative. We don't know what's going to go on with that. And then in September, the power barges contract is up. And then at the end of the year, we have the contracts are up with the distribution service providers as well. And so, given the failure of authorities to launch a tender process just for the fuel, you look at all of these other contracts coming up and you think, oh my God, how are they going to get things together by the time these other contracts expire in order to ensure that electricity, that the electrical system continues to function at all?
Right, and this week we heard that there will be now a new sort of public tender held for the import of fuel sometime in April. But it's really funny and sort of sad that Lebanon is a country where people seem to know when the next fuel barge is coming in, and this is something that makes nightly news headlines, and it's sort of ridiculous and just a sign of how people's lives are completely upended, not only by the electricity cuts themselves, but then by the stress of this whole issue of, oh God, are we going to have the fuel barge coming in, and when will that arrive, and how many days will it take to offload the fuel barge? And it's just these things that really should be happening behind the scenes and in the back end of the state, but really come to the fore in this country because nothing seems to work properly, and nothing seems to be going in the direction it should be going. And one of those things is sadly the country's the situation with coronavirus and new cases. We are now pretty much 2 months into lockdown, into some kind of lockdown in Lebanon, and over a month of that has been this very hard lockdown where most businesses are closed, where shops are closed, where you for a long time had to order from the supermarket. You couldn't even go to the supermarket. And despite having being in lockdown for almost 2 months, we are now seeing numbers rising again. We are seeing cases steadily above 3,000, whereas last week they were sort of around the 2,000, 2,500 mark. We've seen deaths actually increase as well. So new cases are up almost 20% in the last week, and deaths I think is around 5 or 6%. And this is all happening as the country is in the process of reopening. Next week we are supposed to see shops and malls reopen to customers. And this morning, the head of the Rafiq Hariri University Hospital, Firas Abyad, warned about this and was saying, there is a perception in Lebanon that the COVID situation has gotten better. That is not true. Things are getting much worse, and we're going towards reopening. And as that is happening, we have the vaccinations still taking place at an extremely slow rate. We've had, I think, 40,000 vaccines, give or take, given out in the past 2 weeks. And we still have, I think, under 10% of the main priority group, the 1A group, which is the elderly and healthcare workers who have actually received the vaccine. The number of vaccines is ramping up slightly. So we got 40K over this weekend, where we're recording the podcast, that are supposed to be given to people next week. And so we'll get to maybe a total number of 80,000 vaccines given out. But at the current rate we're going at, AUB this week released a report saying that we would only get to herd immunity in 2025. And I don't know about you guys, but if it takes to 2025, I mean, my God, there's sort of that's just a horrifying thought. And so we do expect the rate to increase a little bit, but the problem is that we're nowhere near, being in a position where the amount of vaccines is actually going to reduce the number of total cases. And the number of total cases is rising, and we're reopening the country. So it honestly seems like we're going to a really bad place.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is compounded as well by the scandal that broke out this past week. So we've had 2 weeks so far, the vaccination campaign. The first week, everything seemed to be going great. There was a lot of optimism. We had, a whole lot of positive stories come out about, okay, the authorities, the people who are in charge of this are doing things right. They're ramping up the capacity. They've come up with this distribution plan, all of this stuff. There's not going to be any WASTA involved in this whatsoever. And then this week happened, and all of that went away, right? And Timour, you actually broke this story on Tuesday morning, right? So do you want to tell us what happened?
Right. So Tuesday morning, I wake up to a text from a source saying, I've heard that MPs are going to Parliament to get vaccinated. And so I call the Secretary General of Parliament, Adnan Dahir, and I'm like, listen, our MP is getting vaccinated at Parliament today. And he says, yes, I mean, it's kind of happening only for those above 75, but yeah, it is happening. And so I'm like, okay, well, this seems like it's something of public interest. And so I tweeted it out. And then within 10 minutes of the tweet, the World Bank regional head, Saroj Kumar Jha, had commented on the tweet saying that this would be a violation of the national plan. He urged everybody to stay in line. And then shortly afterwards, he posted another tweet saying, clarifying that if this is confirmed, they could suspend financing of the vaccinations and of Lebanon's COVID-19 response. The World Bank has agreed to provide Lebanon with a $34 million loan that's repurposed from a previous loan for the COVID-19 response and for vaccination. They're funding vaccinations for over 2 million people in the country. And so they then threatened to suspend the financing. The regional head came out here and said, listen, if this is confirmed, we might suspend that financing. And then sort of the story kept unfolding. We got a report from local media that people actually had been vaccinated. And then we find out that, hey, this whole thing about it being people above 75 and within this priority category doesn't seem to be actually true, because it turns out that about half the people who got the vaccine were under 75, and that includes Elil Fizli, the deputy head of parliament, people like Ghazi Zaitar, who Lebanese people will know from other scandals, such as the scandal involving Swiss arms, which he seemed to distribute among his bodyguards. And that led to a suspension of Swiss arms sale to Lebanon. You'll also know Ghazi Zaitar from the Beirut port blast investigation, where he was one of the MPs who managed to get rid of Fadi Sawan by filing that motion to dismiss Sawan. Ghazi Zaitar, of course, there was a suspect. And there's a number of other MPs who also got it, who were under 75, and parliamentary staff, 6 of them, who one of them was actually 65 years old. And then, we went from this period of sort of, okay, learning the names of the MPs and those involved and the World Bank sort of lashing out. Then to the question of, okay, what happens now? Will we see an apology? Will we see, kind of any kind of regret? And the answer, of course, was no. Fideszli then proceeded to go into a meltdown. He did this sort of seemingly racist, repeatedly saying, mispronouncing Saroj Kumar Jha's name as Farrouj, which means rotisserie chicken, or Marrouche, which is kind of like a nonsense word. And he did this over and over again, seemingly on purpose. He did it with me in an interview, then on TV several times. Fideszli then proceeded to go on several shows and staunchly defend the vaccination of MPs, saying that it was because of all of their hard work. And really had a complete meltdown across several, across social media platforms and the media. And then it sort of dies down, and until we hear from the health minister more than 24 hours later, and he basically goes on Télé Liban and says, no, nothing wrong here. It's no big deal. And in fact, I did this out of appreciation for MPs who spent 7 days passing an emergency law to allow for vaccinations in the country. And so that sort of was in a way the cherry on the pie, with basically no kind of regret from anyone in authority, really. And that's sort of where we are today. We haven't heard from the World Bank yet, or really members of the international community who condemned this, except for a generic statement that was shared to several of their Twitter accounts, where they basically said, we're helping with the vaccination drive, but we expect people not to skip the line. And so it seems that's kind of where it's ending. And in a way, it seems like they're going to get away with this. And I just had a little bit of background here because, it was sort of surprising to me to see the regional head of the World Bank, very quickly, within 10 minutes of me posting the tweet, coming out and, making some big statements here, threatening to suspend financing. And so apparently, I had some discussions with various people involved. And so apparently the background here is that the international community, the World Bank and donor nations are in very tense discussions with Lebanon, with Lebanese officials over aid distribution. And the idea here is basically that they are fed up with financing the Lebanese political system indirectly by giving money to the central bank that then, ends up being seized by the central bank and sort of the rest and being handed out to people in Lebanese lira. This is an issue that really has come to the fore with a $250,000 World Bank loan, that we spoke about at length, I think 2 podcasts ago, where we were speaking about, this loan that is coming in dollars from the international community, but then supposed to be handed out in liras. And apparently, the thing that sort of pushed everyone over the edge is the fact that Lebanon's MPs were getting vaccinated while they were discussing this $250,000,000 loan. Literally in the session or right before the session where they're discussing this massive loan that there's a lot of, sort of controversy around, they're actually getting vaccinated in violation of the national plan that was agreed to by the World Bank. And so it was literally the situation of what the fuck. That I think led to Saroj's outburst, and I think since it has been backtracked a bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the World Bank's shoes right now, it is you're in sort of a strange position, I think, for them, because Hassan Hamad as well, when he came out a couple of days after the scandal broke and finally broke his silence, he said part of the reasoning, in addition to saying this is a nothing burger, he also said, we're sovereign. We're allowed to do this. We're not under some sort of international tutelage or anything like that, which is a great line and everything. But at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, but you agreed to follow certain rules and now you're breaking that agreement. So I'm not sure how much sovereignty really enters into the discussion right now. And so if you're on the World Bank side of things, you've got a lot of things to consider. There is, number one, the fact that these politicians agreed with you on one thing and then have quite clearly ignored that, right, to their own benefit, which is something that you wanted to avoid in the first place, but it's happened now. So how do you respond? Well, you have to think not just about Lebanon. Well, you have to think first off about, what happens with Lebanon. As you mentioned, this $246 million loan that they're negotiating right now. There is that. And then there is just this larger moral hazard, right? Lebanon is not the only country that the World Bank is giving loans to in order to buy vaccines. There are 3 other countries, and there may be more in the future. And so if you are the World Bank, you have to think, oh no, we really need to put in other safeguards to ensure that this doesn't happen elsewhere as well. And that could lead to certain delays in vaccines getting to people as well. So, I mean, if you are the World Bank, you don't want to cut off funding necessarily because this is a humanitarian issue. And if you do, you're essentially punishing the people for the problems of their government and the bad faith of their government. But then at the same time, you have these larger considerations to take into account.
I mean, this was the dilemma that we faced back in during the uprising of October 17, where a lot of the attention, especially by the diaspora, was dedicated to convincing the international community to stop giving money to Lebanon, based on the idea that they are funding and kind of providing oxygen to the Lebanese establishment and not the Lebanese people. But when things get, when basically shit hits the fan on a wide scale and poverty is increasing dramatically and all of that, then, there is a sense of guilt and calling for that from a social point of view, from a human point of view, to say the World Bank, stop giving money to Lebanon. At the same time, like, there is no scenario that I can imagine where the Lebanese establishment allows the influx of hundreds of millions of dollars in the country without corrupting it in one way or another, without, making it in one way or another about sectarian clientelism or giving advantage to this or that. And with the vaccines, it's a matter of class and a matter of privilege, right? Like, who's getting it first, the politicians or the people who need it, etc. With the poverty program, it's going to be a matter of who among the poor deserves it more, and how that relates to their politics. But I think it's a very it's a really tricky thing to be it's a really tricky area, because on one hand, without the government, it's very difficult to implement these programs. Be it the vaccine rollout, you need the health ministry, or the poverty program, you need the social affairs ministry, and you can't totally rely on private actors such as civil society, etc., because those two are not impartial and they don't have the same capacities. On the other hand, you're basically funding the same establishment. So yeah.
And could I just mention here that this issue is not, I mean, we're talking about the Lebanese political class here as having done this, and that really isn't a stretch. The reason that we're using that term is because if you look at the affiliations of the MPs involved and add in the fact that President Aoun also was vaccinated at the presidential palace in Baabda last Sunday, along with a bunch of his staffers away from International Red Cross oversight, then you see essentially every major party is implicated in this. So obviously the FPM, because Aoun is the founder, and also Eli Ferzli, while not a party member, is a member of their bloc in parliament. They're implicated. The Amal movement had a number of MPs that got vaccinated. They're implicated.
As well as the finance minister, who was, a Birri appointee.
Absolutely. Even so, Hezbollah didn't have any MPs. However, Hamad Hassan, the health minister, was essentially appointed by them, or his name was put forward by them. So Hezbollah as well is implicated in this. And Hezbollah's biggest nemesis on the Lebanese political scene, the Lebanese forces, they had two MPs that were one party member and one member of their political bloc in parliament who received these vaccines. They're implicated as well. Probably the closest thing to anyone being outside of this scandal is the Future movement, who had Mohammed Kabara, who is not a party member, but who does run on their lists and is an MP for Tripoli, long time, basically with the Future movement. He was vaccinated, but before the dozen parliament. So for the most part, this basically cuts across the entirety of the political spectrum. It seems sort of like an agreement by those in charge, like, oh, we're not going to make a big deal out of this. We want to put this behind us and not use this as political. Nobody can really use this as a means to attack another political party because so many people are implicated. However, that doesn't mean that parties are not attacking each other. The politics isn't happening. And we saw a really major escalation of that just this weekend in Bkerki.
Indeed. One of those moments where you have protesters going to Bkerki, which historically aren't too many, and are always significant, right? Because Bkerki is not, Bkerki is the place of the Maronite church in Lebanon. The head of the Maronite church, the patriarch Bashar al-Ra'i, is there. And it has a lot of symbolism in Lebanon, especially obviously for the Christian population. And when Bkerki moves on the politics with a move such as this one, as calling for people to come and demonstrate in Bkerki, this means that there is an escalation or there is a situation where the usual politicians can't do the job for Lebanon's Christians, so the patriarch must step up. And this is basically what's happening now. And this time the enemy or the threat is basically disguised as the whole political establishment in Bashar al-Ra'i's discourse, but it's mostly about Hezbollah. So this protest or this demonstration was to call for a UN-sponsored international political conference for Lebanon that basically does several things I will mention quickly. Most important of those is to confirm that Lebanon is an impartial country in regional and international conflicts. Okay, impartiality is the main idea that Bashar al-Ra'i is pushing for. But under these slogans, you have lots of various components that might be problematic in other ways. So, for example, he wants first to make this impartiality in the constitution, right? So the constitution Lebanon would clearly state that Lebanon does not side with one side and another in international conflicts, which is a very weird thing to do. Especially that it's coming from it comes in a region with so many conflicts, some of which are probably much more polarizing than others. But Lebanon being next to Palestine and being next to Syria, the idea that Lebanon would be impartial was always never taken so seriously, because impartiality should be coming from outwards and inwards at the same time. The second most important thing in this was that Ra'i said the international conference must confirm and impose the implementation of previous UN Security Council resolutions concerning Lebanon. Obviously, if you hear that might mean you might think of many, including ones that Israel is violating all the time. But what he means is 1559, which is the one that says that all militias that haven't basically given their arms to the state after the civil war have to do that now. And this was passed just before Hariri's assassination, Rafiq Hariri's assassination, and it was targeting Hezbollah. So he said it, and he basically confirmed it by saying that we need to have one army protecting Lebanon, and that Hezbollah's military capacities are kind of subjugated to the army, so that we have one official defense strategy. So, there are many other aspects of it related to Christian-Muslim balance and all of that. There were weird things happening, like, supposedly this was not a partisan protest, but there were so many LF flags, Lebanese forces flags, because the main political force that was backing Ra'i in this move was the Lebanese forces, apart from many anti-establishment people who saw this as one of the last channels to voice their anger about the situation, and also like to warn about the blocked road or basically the cliff that we're jumping off with the whole Hezbollah issue. But one of the funny things, in my opinion, was that at some point when he was speaking, some people interrupted him with a chant, and the chant was that people want to reform the system, which for me was quite symbolic, because the discourse that Ra'i presents and the record that Ra'i has is always about minor reform. He's always protecting Maronites' positions in the state, including Riyad Salemi or Aoun at different points, or whoever the president is, and so did the patriarchs before him. So the patriarchy itself is at the heart of the sectarian system in Lebanon, the Maronite patriarchy, and has always been an ally to basically political Maronitism or the main Maronite positions in the state, regardless of the records of those people.
But it seems like that might be changing a bit, and I think that what happened yesterday was in effect seen as Bashar al-Ra'i pulling Christian cover from President Aoun, who now really is in a position, I would say, of unprecedented weakness. And I think that that's tied to the position that Aoun, backed by Hezbollah, took a year and a half ago during the Lebanon protests. They basically made themselves the face of the system and the remaining strongest pillar of the current system. And what we've seen is, an unprecedented deterioration in the current country since then. Aoun and Hezbollah, rightly or wrongly, are portrayed as sort of being the keepers of that system. And what we saw yesterday was, in effect, I think, sort of a sign of how weak Aoun has become. He's old, he's sort of withering, and in a way is kind of a lame duck president. And what we see here seems to be sort of a priming for 2022, which is really, being chalked up to be the pivotal year for Lebanon, with municipal, parliamentary, and presidential elections, so the end of Aoun's term. And we expect the March 8th majority in parliament to lose that majority in the elections if they are held. And just a small note here is that we actually got an indication this week of the types of excuses that may be used to not hold elections, which many of us fear, journalists, activists fear in Lebanon, because we have a precedent for that in the past, having gone without elections between 2009 and 2018. So Lebanon is supposed to have by-elections, 4 seats left vacant by 2 MPs who died from COVID and 8 who resigned after the blast. But it seems that those elections are now going to be postponed from their date in March because, and this is what the Interior Minister said, because of COVID, because of the Tripoli security situation, because polling centers in Beirut were destroyed by the blast, and get this, because the state can't even afford the indelible ink that you use when you go into the polling booth to show that you've voted. They said in a memo that they need somebody to donate the ink to the state because they don't have it and they can't afford it.
Yeah, and this is already a violation of the Constitution. When a seat in Parliament becomes vacant within 2 months, according to the Constitution, there should be by-elections for that to be filled. Obviously, that did not happen in the case of the 8 MPs that resigned in the wake of the port explosion. And it doesn't seem, if we're pushing off till May, that means that also isn't going to happen in the other 2 seats that became vacant due to COVID deaths. So when you hear Lebanese politicians going on and on about the Lebanese Constitution and how we have to adhere to the Constitution, keep in mind that they are not exactly consistent on this.
No, and they can't even afford the ink for the elections. I mean, look at where we've come as a state. You know, it's just serious failed state territory when you can't even afford the ink to hold elections,
Yeah.
whether that's the truth or whether it's an excuse or not. And amid all of this happening, of course, there's no sign of a government. And it appears, in fact, that the entire thing is a charade. And everyone knows it because it seems to me that Hariri does not want to be the prime minister of the state as it keels over. He's very happy to have Aoun be the one who sort of, carries that and is the figurehead of Lebanon's demise. And come 2022, maybe things will change. And it seems that everybody knows it's a farce. I recently spoke to a diplomat who told me literally that it's a quote farce and it's a circus. And in this situation, the international donors who continue to sort of, prop up in some way this system and provide tiny, meager aid to people, they're even saying that they don't want to do this anymore. And so we might even see those meager flows of aid reduced. And so really, we really are in the situation of the Titanic, where it's like, where its bow is in the air and it's about to snap in half. And while all of this is happening and everything is falling apart, and we have complete a lack of accountability from anyone at the top of the government or the state for the terrible situation we're in, we have protesters from Tripoli being tried for terrorism at the military court in Beirut. And so this is an issue that's sort of unfolded over the past month when people were arrested following the protests and riots in Tripoli that were sort of over the deteriorating economic situation during the COVID lockdown. And what we've seen is that we've had several dozen people who have been detained for almost a month now, and they're being accused of terrorism. They're charged with terrorism, charges that could potentially carry the death sentence in Lebanon, even though it's not implemented. And this is sort of being seen as really a pivotal moment because it's the first time since Lebanon's uprising that began 18 months ago that any one of the protesters has been charged with terrorism. Terrorism usually reserved for people who fight with ISIS or people who fight with various groups or organize attacks against the state. And now we have protesters being charged with terrorism. And the simple response of the families of these protesters is they're not, my son is not the terrorist. The people in charge of this country are the terrorists.
And this is only enabled, like the whole terrorism thing is only enabled by this scapegoating of Tripolis people for many, many years now, at least since 2013, as being prone to be radicalized or prone to be, or Tripoli being what do you call it, fertile ground for Sunni terrorism in Lebanon. This stigma has been kind of imposed on Tripoli and remains in the background. So that's kind of why this is what enables them to, when it enables the judiciary to be so outrageous in its behavior and like prosecute young protesters as terrorists.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. At this point, Timour is going to leave us, and we're going to bring in Lydia Assouad to talk about inequality. Lydia, welcome to the show. This has been a very long time in the making. We've been talking about getting you on the show for, I think, almost a year now, so we're very, very excited to have you.
Yes, me too. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you research?
Yes, sure. So I'm a PhD candidate at the Paris School of Economics in France, and also a research fellow at the World Inequality Lab, which is specializing in measuring, creating data on income and wealth inequality from many countries in the world and many different time periods. And it's a lab founded by Thomas Bkerki, Gabriel Zuckman, Emmanuel Seiz, among others.
And so I think it's very important to set the stage for this discussion. We know that there are certain things that are problematic in the Lebanese system, but I don't think that a lot of us quite grasp just how unequal the system in Lebanon is. Can you walk us through what your research shows about Lebanon and the inequality that exists here?
So yes, as part of my research, I've managed to get access to new micro-fiscal data from the Lebanese Ministry of Finance for the 2005 and 2014 period. And fiscal data are key to measure the entire income distribution in any country. The entire methodology of the World Inequality Lab is based on this. And when I did this, when I estimated the distribution of income for Lebanon, I found really striking results that income is extremely concentrated in Lebanon. So basically, to give you a few statistics, I found that the top 10% richest individuals earned almost 55% of total national income over the period, and that the top 1% richest earned almost a quarter of the total national income of the country. So to give some perspective, in France, the top 1% gained approximately 11% of the total national income. And in the US, where we are constantly speaking about inequality, the top 1% earned less than 25% of the total national income. So really Lebanon is extremely unequal. So when we know that the richest earn that much, it also means in the case of Lebanon that the poorest half of the population received very little. So approximately 10% of the total national income. And the middle 40% of the distribution, which broadly corresponds to the middle class, received 35% of total national income. So we really have in Lebanon an extremely polarized social structure with most of the resources going to the richest and nothing is left to the poorest. And the middle class is basically shrinking. And this is for the 2005 and 2014 period. So even before the crisis that the country is experiencing right now.
And that's not only high when you look at a society in isolation, but also comparatively, right, to other societies. When we were discussing this before the episode, you were telling us that it was one of the most unequal countries in the world. How does it compare to countries that are known for inequality?
Yes, so really those figures make Lebanon comparable to countries such as Brazil or South Africa that are extremely unequal. And it's really striking because there, the extreme levels of inequalities are largely explained by the strong persistence of racial privileges. And so Lebanon has levels of inequality as high as South Africa, for example. So it's really extreme. And basically in the World Inequality Lab, we consider that Lebanon, as other Middle Eastern countries, represent sort of what we call an inequality frontier. That is systems that produce the highest level of inequalities in the world. It's complicated to imagine a system that can produce even a higher concentration of economic resources. So, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so you've explained, why income, or you've explained that income inequality is extreme, even on this sort of on the grandest scale possible. This is extreme income inequality, but why is it that we're at this point? What are the factors that got us to where we are now?
Yeah, so I think to answer you in one sentence, there is one observation that we can make is that those richest groups I was talking about really coincide with the ruling elite. And for an example, the billionaires, the 7 billionaires in Lebanon are politicians or clearly affiliated with some political parties. So it really shows that the causes of this concentration of resources are not only economic, but really also political. And I really do believe that it's the entire political economy of the country that contributes to it, and that the causes are really systemic, and that the system is really rotten in this regard. And basically, so one first source is really institutional, and we can track it back to the Taif Agreement of 1989 that sealed the end of the civil war, but which also re-established the Lebanese consociational, sorry for the French accent, democracy, which basically seems good at first, when we look at it first, it's a political regime that ensures that each religious group is represented in the government and in national institutions, and that everyone can influence policy in order to prevent conflicts and civil wars. So it seems attractive, but in practice, and as in other countries with similar political arrangements, it has many perverse effects and is associated with really bad governance outcome. Because basically it enables the creation of what you can call a party cartel, which recent research by Christiana Barrera, for example, has really well described. And it's basically a political arrangement where you have representatives from different parties and which are ideologically opposed that constitutes the national unity government. For example, we've seen in Lebanon since 2005 that have to share power, and such arrangements basically do not manage to implement cohesive policies, consistent policies for the common good, because they disagree basically.
Exactly, and one of the things that we always say when we're talking about the Lebanese system is that the way that power is distributed, as you're saying, it kind of eclipses all the divisions within sectarian communities at the in favor of the divisions between sectarian communities. So when you have like politicians who are Sunni leading the sect more or less politically and accumulating as much resources as possible from this process, as was the case with many families, most notably maybe the Hariri family, and you have this division between the Sunnis as a whole, as a political entity, more or less, and the Shia or the Druze, etc. And you have this case in every one of those, then the interests of people at the bottom of all of these sects, the working classes, the poor, among all of these sects are hidden behind this illusion that they are all of them are part of one group that has one political interest. So the worker who is driving, delivering food, and the billionaires from the same sect supposedly have some interest that is common among them, as opposed to the delivery driver and his colleague from another one.
Yes, exactly.
So I agree with you that this system, it's not only like at the level of political symbolism and political polarization, but when this exists, then accountability is much harder to achieve, and accountability is basically at the source of most of the problems that we talk about in this podcast. Just before you join us, we were talking about many issues, and accountability and the lack of accountability is always at the center of it. Actually, the previous episode was dedicated to this topic. But in this context, in the economic context, this supposed homogeneity within each class and the sectarian power sharing system that we're talking about, and the lack of accountability, have taken us to a place that we compare to a country like South Africa, which has a history of racist apartheid, and basically the whites concentrating all the resources among them, which historically explains inequality in a much more logical way than the case of Lebanon and the Lebanese society. So it's really fascinating how little is spoken of this issue, although we are now doing as bad as possible in this sphere.
Exactly, like in the Lebanese case, it's much more trickier, like mechanisms, etc., like less direct than the apartheid in South Africa, but with really similar like results. And you really said two like key things, I think, that are consequences of the sectarianism, is that those party cartel I was telling you about, like they managed to agree at least on one thing, is to stay in power and to create barriers of entry so that there are no new political actors that can enter. And this like prevents any accountability. So then they can basically pass all laws and policies that favor their interests. And the second thing that is also like a bit trickier as a mechanism, is that basically this sectarianism, like it's crystallizes and institutionalizes sects and religious identity. And we see, like, we all know it, like sectarianism enters in every aspect of life in Lebanon. And basically it creates citizens that identify more with their sect than their class, which also encourages clientelism. And the political elites have really strong incentives to maintain and strengthen these identities that allow them to favor financial and economic arrangements within their sects and to control their respective region. And then they can amplify the rent they extract from the financial and real estate sectors that are the key sectors in the Lebanese economy. And basically in exchange of this, they just provide to their communities basic public goods such as jobs, reduction in school fees. And even if Lebanese probably know these schemes, they did not overthrow the system, because in the absence of the state, you prefer to have public good provided by wealthy politicians from your sect than having nothing at all. So this really creates a vicious circle that enrich the political elite. Due to this rentier economy, the absence of the state, that creates extreme level of inequality, which increase the reliance of the public on the services provided by those groups, and after maintain them in power, etc. That's how it's explosive and creates huge inequality, basically.
Yes, indeed. I mean, on one hand, you have this political system that drives up inequality, and on the other hand, you have economic policies, especially in the last 30 years after the end of the civil war in Lebanon, that might have contributed significantly to the inequality that we have today. And when you talk about the sectarian power sharing, we're mainly talking about rent-seeking activities that the politicians are exploiting the system to extract. And when we talk about economic policy making, we also see that the whole economy has been pushed towards rent-based sectors after the civil war, especially real estate and banking, at the expense of productive sectors that the Lebanese economy had relied on more in the past, such as agriculture and industry. And the data after the civil war show that, and these were not accidents or unfortunate events or the result of other countries shining in industrial sectors or whatever other excuses that people usually give for this. This was the result of policies related to monetary policies and economic policies and trade policies that Lebanon adopted after the civil war, which said, okay, Lebanon is not a productive country and we shouldn't hope to be. We should just focus on creating this. The main idea was creating this country with a capital, Beirut, that attracts everyone to come in as tourists, but also bring in their money, put their deposits in Lebanon, and basically a major part of that was for the Gulf countries to recycle a lot of their petrodollars in Lebanon on their way out to Europe or other places. And this was basically at the heart of it. And that's why you see so many different scenes in Lebanon in high proximity to each other. Like you go to downtown and you see the most, luxurious buildings and the most luxurious brands that are clearly made tailored for tourists more than locals. And you see a banking system, a financial system that is now collapsing, but used to survive on these foreign funds for so long. At the same time, you see the slums, you see 60% poverty rate, etc.
Yeah, and those very rich areas of downtown, are they full or empty? Well, they're empty, right? And so you can see how the system was basically engineered to do this one thing, and it really failed at doing that. It did not attract the kind of money that it needed to be on a sustainable basis. And now we have, this these sectors that you talked about, the financial sector, the real estate sector, are just in absolute crisis now.
Exactly. And when we go talk about the tax system, we will see how this is also reflected in taxation. So the tax system itself has had a role in exacerbating inequality. Can you explain to us, Lydia, based on your research, how you see that this might have happened?
Yes, exactly. The tax laws were part of all the laws decided at that time that contributed to this rentier economy that you just described. And basically, the only motivation of everything, that all laws that were passed, was just short-term rent seeking, which contributed to what you just described. And one aspect of it was just to create a tax system that is super pro-rich, basically. And the consequence is that Lebanon really has a very low, a tax system that collects very low fiscal revenues. So to give you some figures, the tax revenues in Lebanon, it's equal to 15% of its GDP, so gross domestic product, in 2018, which is similar to the tax revenues of Senegal or Costa Rica, for an example. And it's lower to the average of most developing regions, including sub-Saharan African countries, but the average is 17%. So really, Lebanon does not collect much fiscal revenue. And basically, this means that the country is unable to finance social policies and deliver basic public goods. And to come back to what we said earlier, this explains why, like, the margin of maneuver sectarian leaders have, like, you have no state, no fiscal revenue, no national public policies. So then if you give just a little bit of social policies, like, you attract, like, support from voters. So first, no fiscal revenues. Second, within this small tax system, most of the revenues comes from indirect taxation, which is taxes that do not depend on the income of individual. So those are mostly consumption taxes, so the value added taxes. And those are regressive. It means that as it does not depend on the income of individual, it's like proportional no matter what you buy. The rich pays as much as the poor, but for the poor, it's like a way higher share of their total income. And in Lebanon, the indirect taxes represent almost 60% of all revenues. So it's extremely high. Third, like, characteristic of the fiscal system is that only 11% of the tax revenues is collected through a progressive schemes. That is, the richer pay more than the poorest. The more income you have, the more you pay. And even this progressive scheme on income is based on a very archaic old system that taxes every income source separately. So if you, for an example, you are a rentier, you own two apartments and you rent one, but you also receive you're also an employee and receive income from this job. For the tax administration, you appear twice: as the rentier, and you pay tax on the rent you gain, and as an income earner. But you are not taxed on the total income you earn. So basically, you are not taxed according to the real rank you have in the total income distribution. Basically, like, the richest, which often have several sources of income, are favored by this system.
Exactly, which goes against the point of progressive taxation in the first place, right? Because usually progressive taxation stands on the basis that you know how much money each person is making, and that's how you tax them so that it's fair for society. But if a rich person has 5 sources of income and they're all pretty minimal normal looked at separately, and then the tax rates they're going to pay on each of them will be lower than if they had one number or a global tax that they're paying.
Exactly. And add on top of that the fact that the progressive rates are really low in Lebanon compared to the rest of the world. So recently it was increased to 25% for the top marginal tax rates, which are the rates that the richest are paying. But this is still way lower than most countries of the world. So developed, like, rich countries such as France, the US, but also similar developing countries. Really, Lebanon has low tax rates compared to the rest of the world. And also another, like, particularity of the direct taxation in the country is that most capital incomes are either not taxed. There are so many exemptions and rules by which you can basically avoid paying taxes on capital income. And most of them are not taxed under a progressive scheme, but with a flat rate, so a proportional rate, which is really in favor of the richest.
And it's really striking going through this list of the way that the tax system is engineered, because, I go back to maybe, 2 or 3 years ago when there were all of these big budget battles, right? And how the Lebanese state was always, was always running these deficits, which caused all of this mounting debt, which Lebanon has now defaulted on. But back then, all of this discussion, at around the Cedra conference and everything like that, the conversation about fixing the deficit was almost entirely focused on what can we cut and problems in state spending, rather than, I mean, there was a bit on the tax side of things, but really it was sort of around the edges. They were only talking about, doing a global, let's consider everybody's income as one. There really was no, bold proposals for really upending this system at all. Rather, the focus was on why are we paying, more state employees than we should? Why are the budgets this big for spending? So it really goes to show how the narrative was controlled and what people were focused on as potential solutions.
Yeah, completely inappropriate. Like, especially recently, like all the budget reforms that were passed or discussed, the choice of austerity was completely like next to the what was really needed. And it's almost fascinating, like with the WhatsApp tax. You really think like, what were they expecting? Like they were really pushing and keeping doing reforms for more austerity. So basically making the poorest pay more. Until when would have, like, it's really surprising that how long they kept pushing for people to pay more. And on the contrary, making the system like easier for the richest. Like it's, almost naive.
Yeah, it's surreal. It's surreal. When the WhatsApp tax it wasn't officially enacted, but it was approved by government. I was in a real shock first because it was the most regressive tax that I've ever heard of. Because poor people in Lebanon use WhatsApp more than rich people because before the crisis, at least, the cost of the telecommunications in Lebanon relative to salaries and the exchange rate, etc., was one of the highest worldwide. So it's not a country where you can just call up someone and you have unlimited minutes, etc. It's very it's very expensive to use a normal phone line. So everyone resorted to WhatsApp. And telecom companies here like facilitated the process by making WhatsApp, like having a special subscription for WhatsApp so that everyone can use WhatsApp for their daily business activities, for the communications with family, etc. And to impose a tax on that, so hitting the poorest the most, is absolutely insane. I mean, it's insane because it's surreal and because it's against WhatsApp's rules and because it's never heard of. But our reliance on VAT, on TVA, as you were saying before, our reliance on regressive taxation is quite similar. So much VAT on all of these different products you're buying that are not considered essential products exempted from VAT, which is basically most things we buy in life. And when you think about the percentage that this is taking out of poor people's money compared to rich people's money, it's much more, right? Because poor people are much more like the what they can do with their disposable income, with the money they actually have to spend, is much less. So they focus on necessary things such as buying the basic items and food, etc., clothes, etc. And all of these have VAT, and the VAT was even recently increased to 11%. While rich people have so much money to save, and this money that they are saving, they are not paying this tax on.
No, and I just want to point out really quickly that this is not just like a problem with Lebanese politicians. The focus on austerity, the focus on increasing VAT, that's come largely from abroad, from the international community. So it really is. I mean, this is not just like a problem of Lebanon's own making. Also, the potential solutions to budgetary crisis and stuff like that. The outside actors were pushing Lebanon towards, further towards the cliff here by proposing that austerity be the answer rather than any sort of fundamental reform that would address these deep inequalities that we see in society here.
Yes, exactly. And again, it was really like not knowing the Lebanese context because as Nizar just said, like the tax base is so large. You have so many rich people in Lebanon, like only if you look at the 7 billionaires, so only 7 individuals, a bit more with their family, like their net worth on average since 2010 represents almost 30% of the total national income. So in France, for an example, it's like all billionaires, and there are maybe more than 7. France, their worth is less than 10% of the national income. So it's really insane when you know the context and when you know how large the tax base is and how many rich people and like their weight, like to make the choice of directing all the weight on the poor. It's really inappropriate.
Exactly. And I mean, I agree with that. And when you look at the specificities of the Lebanese tax system, it's not only discrimination against the poor, it's also discrimination against the productive sectors that we are talking about. So we mentioned the rentierization of the economy, or the focus on rent-based sectors. When you look at the tax system, even today, after the recent amendments in response to the fiscal crisis and all of that, and I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast. So if you're a productive company, for example, producing labne and jibne and things that are real and have real value in the market in Lebanon, and you employ like 10 workers and you make $150,000 a year or more, then you are subjected to the highest bracket in the tax system that we have, which is 25%. And this is on regardless of exchange rate, right? 225 million Lebanese pounds. It's not in dollars, of course. So if it's a small company like this one, and now because of the exchange rate, it's a much smaller company that makes 225 million Lebanese pounds in a year, has to pay 25%, then you would expect, for example, a bank that makes 4,000 times more in revenues or even net profits, like Blom Bank or Bank Audi, etc., to be paying more in taxes. And then you look at the tax that the banks pay and all financial companies, and it's a flat tax at 17%, as you were saying. So basically, you pay 8% more in taxes if you are in the productive sectors that the politicians pretend to be supportive of, and that you are producing something that people need to eat and live, and you are employing people relative to your capital, you are employing more people than the bank, and all of those great things in economic terms, and still you are paying 8% more than someone who makes thousands of times more in profits.
Yeah, it's so key what you just said. And on top of this, the tax system enables the richest to avoid or evade taxation even more. So basically, for an example, now the way the tax system works with e-taxation makes that in the formal sector, taxes on wages are easily collected, and therefore small and middle productive companies pay more social security contribution and taxes on the employees they have. So they are really taxed heavily by the government, whereas some banks and larger companies have much higher ways to evade and not be taxed. And so you really have a system where, especially like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where to create a company, to hire people, to be productive was much more costly than actually to invest in rent-seeking activity and in the real estate sector and not produce everything, which doomed the economy and led to the crisis we see today.
Okay, so if we know what went wrong and where the policies failed us in the past, what are some of the solutions that are feasible or that should be done to fix this problem?
So one optimistic thing that I can say, when you look at the tax system today, there is a big margin of maneuver for Lebanon. So the tax system is so bad and so under the standards of the rest of the world, etc. So just pushing Lebanon to the average of what is done in other countries could really help increase both revenues, but also improve the fairness of the system. And in particular, there are four main things I think that can be done and could really help with dealing with social justice, which is what we said, to create first a general income tax, which taxes all income sources together and at a progressive rate. So which is not the case now, as we said, the sources are taxed separately. And this should include more capital income. So all the capital incomes, dividends, interest, capital gains that are taxed now at flat rates should be included in this general income tax. We should simplify the law with less exemptions, etc., and increase the top marginal tax rates, which as I was saying, are super low compared to the rest of the world. And second, I think it's time to think about wealth taxation. So first, what would be really needed is to do an exceptional wealth tax as we've seen, for example, in Argentina recently, like to help deal with the COVID crisis and all the other crises in the country. And for example, if we only put like 10% on the billionaire's wealth, we could almost have 3% of the national income, like to give you order of magnitude, which means that if we also reach multimillionaires, etc., this could yield more revenues. But also, I think it's also time to think of implementing and establishing a more comprehensive and progressive wealth tax, given like for example, the booming real estate sectors and the fact that the economy is based on like real estate and financial activities. So there is also a tax base there. And finally, like this should be complemented with a lot of laws to fight tax evasion, which is the national sport in Lebanon. And all this could like really raise more revenues that are urgently needed now, and really deal with inequality that are extreme in the countries, as we said.
These all sound like really just basic, straightforward solutions. Very simple, but obviously that the devil is in the details, and the devil is actually in getting a system on board that, you know, these sorts of solutions. I mean, you mention a wealth tax to anybody who is wealthy and they recoil in horror. And unfortunately here, if Lebanese politicians wanted to implement such a thing, they would essentially be going against their own interests, though, right?
Yes. So obviously that's, as I said, the causes of the system now are political, and I believe that the answer must be political. And as we said, like it's the entire system that is rotten, that contributes to all this accumulation of wealth in the hands of a minority. So this won't change if there is not like a political and drastic and radical reform of the current system, which must be decided collectively and democratically. So all this is really conditional on having a political transition that puts in power people that would agree to pass such laws. And this is, of course, open, like it's an open question. But then I think that the fiscal reforms could be like really straightforward, simple bullet points of a new economic model that is really needed in the country right now, but conditional on a political transition, which stays like uncertain right now.
I think, the discussions about taxes and inequality, I like them, not because I'm a nerd about it, but also because like it reveals to us how political the whole thing is. It's not only in Lebanon. Taxes and inequality and economic policy in general is political, is highly political, and it represents which political interests and which class interests are dominant in society. So when we're diagnosing the problem, we'll have to touch on politics. And when we were thinking of the solutions just now, what is feasible, what might be done, we have to think, oh, okay, who's doing that? Are people like Riyad Salemi and Saad Hariri and these people who have the most influence maybe on economic and monetary policy making in Lebanon going to ever lead a policy effort with these kind of reforms? It's just not gonna happen, right? Because it's, as you're just saying, Lydia, it goes against their interests. So this is what fascinates me, is that till today, even after the October 17 revolution, even after what is happening today in Lebanon, there are some people that still for some reason still believe that a technocratic solution of some sort is viable, or that say, all we need is better people with competence or skills to implement the right policies, scientifically correct policies for Lebanon. And what they ignore is that it's really, all of it is about interests and political interests and class interests, and that when you have the right interests represented in power, then you will definitely find the experts to do it.
Yes, I mean, one possible way out would be like if there is, but we are far from it, but more international coordination on, for example, transparency on financial assets, tax coordination, etc. So there are there are some hope. There is a fascinating research by Juliana Londoño Vélez on the Colombian case, and she shows that okay, so Colombia tried to put a wealth tax, and indeed the wealthiest found new ways to evade, like it was imperfect. But because there was also a risk of detection of such fraud and avoidance due to the Panama Papers leak, it was actually a bit efficient, and it shows that with perhaps better enforcement, so coming from within or like from international coordination, wealth tax can complement, can really work and increase progressivity and raise more revenues. So a way would be to see if there is some international coordination on transparency and taxation. But for sure, taxes are centered to building a new state. So it seems like it's not sexy or glamorous taxation, but actually it's like a key aspect of any thought of a state. Like a state cannot be stable if it cannot taxes its citizens and its richest citizens in particular. And a healthy tax system is key to have a sustainable social contract right now. So yes, I don't know how the power or the will can come from within Lebanon right now, but I do believe it's important and can be done.
So don't let anyone tell you that tax policy is boring or not connected from reality or anything. Tax policy is fucking at the center of everything. It ties together all of these disparate interests into it tells a story of where we're at, and it really does paint the picture of where this inequality came from and how we could possibly fix it, and how there could be a more just society, more equal society at some point in the future if the will is there to change taxes and tax policy, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you want to think of state and politics, you have to think about taxation. You said it super well.
I think we have to leave it right there. Lydia, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fascinating discussion. Probably the episode ran a little bit longer than we thought. And I mean, honestly, we could probably bring you on for 2 or 3 more episodes. But thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of this to us. And hopefully we'll see some positive change from all of this at some point in the future.
Yes, hopefully. And thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here and to be featured in your podcast.
Thank you so much for coming, Lydia. I enjoyed the episode as well. Thank you for listening. Our listeners, we're not going to be back next week. Next week, there's no podcast, but the week after. So tune in and maybe listen to some previous episodes during the next week. Until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Benjamin Redd.
And I'm Lydia Assouad.
And this was the Lebanese Politics Podcast. The Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Redd, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.